Last time we were introduced to what is known as the problem of freedom and foreknowledge. The idea is that there's an apparent conflict between God's perfect knowledge, which seems to entail that he knows everything that is going to happen in the future, with the claim that we act freely. For if God knows precisely what you're going to do, it looks like there isn't really any option available to you. Whatever he knows you're going to do, that's what you're going to do. It might seem like you have several options available, but God knows the one and only option that you're going to choose. So that's the one you're going to do. You can't do anything other than what God knows you're going to do. So how do we get around this problem? I laid out the problem premise by premise last time, and now I want to take a look at how St. Augustine proposes that we address this issue. So St. Augustine actually offers a two-part solution to this problem. I want to first introduce his first part, which he discusses on page 76 and 77 of the text, and then I want to talk about the second part, which occurs on page 78. And then I want to puzzle about, even though he's not explicit about this, because he isn't sort of formulating the argument the same exact way that I did in terms of the numbered premises, I want to puzzle about which premise he's actually denying, and which one of the premises he's actually letting pass through. So let's take a look at then his first part of his two-part solution. So if you have your reading, turn to page 76, and we'll take a look at what he says about this. This comes up on the last paragraph on page 76. He says this: "Just notice how imperceptive someone would have to be to argue thus. If God has foreknown my future will, it is necessary that I will what he has foreknown, since nothing can happen otherwise than he has foreknown it. But if it is necessary, then one must conclude that I will it by necessity and not by will. What extraordinary foolishness! If God foreknew a future will that turned out not to be a will at all, things would indeed happen otherwise than as God foreknew them." Now this is a little bit obscure, but let's take a look at what he says on the next page, on page 77, in the paragraph in the middle. Here's what he says. This is still the first part of his strategy. He says, "Thus we believe both that God has foreknowledge of everything in the future, and that nonetheless we will whatever we will. Since God foreknows our will, the very will that he foreknows will be what comes about. Therefore it will be a will, since it is a will that he foreknows, and it could not be a will unless it were in our power. Therefore he also foreknows this power. It follows then that his foreknowledge does not take away my power. In fact, it is all the more certain that I will have that power, since he whose foreknowledge never errs foreknows that I will have it." So what's going on? This is the first part of his strategy. This is the first way in which he attempts to respond to the argument. What's his point here? What's he trying to say? What he's trying to say is that the argument actually is misunderstanding or imprecisely wording what it is that God knows about the future. He doesn't just know what you will do, he knows what you will freely do. When God knows the future, he knows which of your actions will be freely done and which ones won't. And so when he does know that you're going to do something freely, here's the interesting thing, that doesn't undermine your freedom. What Augustine says is that if God knows what you're going to freely do, then rather than undermining your freedom, it guarantees it. Because if God knows that you're going to freely do something, then of course you're going to freely do it, because that's packed into his knowledge. And that's precisely, I think, the first part of his strategy, is to say that we can preserve our freedom by packing our freedom right into the content of God's knowledge. And the way that we do that is we take a look at the argument again, and every time that it says where God knows what you will do in the future, we sneak in, we insert, right? He knows what you will freely do in the future. And once we insert the freely in those premises that say something about what you will freely do, then when we get down to the premise 5, which denies, right? It says, well, if your art and actions are necessary, then they are not free. Well, let's think about how we have to adjust the premises with our freedom in it. Premise 2 says that if God knows precisely what will happen in the future, then he knows precisely what I will do. Here, what Augustine is recommending that we do is insert our freedom into what God knows. So the way that he would suggest is that we read this premise as, if God knows precisely what will happen in the future, then he knows precisely what I will freely do. And premise 3 becomes, if God knows precisely what I will freely do, then I cannot do anything other than what he knows I will do. I can't not act freely. Premise 4, if I cannot do anything other than what God knows I will freely do, then my actions are necessary. That one seems less clear now that we've inserted the freely there, but especially premise 5. If my actions are necessary, then they are not free. That's where the clash really is apparent, because we've packed our freedom already into, right, what God knows and what it is that I can't but do. And so even though they're necessary in a sense, that doesn't at all follow from that they're not free. And in fact, they're necessarily free, because that is precisely what God knows. So the first part of his strategy then is to pack our knowledge right into, pack our freedom right into God's knowledge, such that God knows not only what you're going to do, but he knows what you're going to freely do. And so rather than undermining your freedom, it guarantees it. What about the second part of his solution? This second part appears on page 78. So it's about right down in the middle of the page. Here's what Augustine says. Unless I am mistaken, you do not force someone to sin just because you foreknow that he is going to sin. Nor does your foreknowledge force him to sin, even if he is undoubtedly going to sin, since otherwise you would not have genuine foreknowledge. So if your foreknowledge is consistent with his freedom in sinning, so that you foreknow what someone else is going to do by his own will, then God forces no one to sin, even though he foresees those who are going to sin by their own will. Why then can't our just God punish those things that his foreknowledge does not force to happen? Just as your memory does not force the past to have happened, God's foreknowledge does not force the future to happen. And just as you remember some things that you have done, but did not do everything that you remember, God foreknows everything that he causes, but does not cause everything that he foreknows. Of such things he is not the evil cause, but the just avenger. Therefore you must understand that God justly punishes the sins that he foreknows, but does not cause. If the fact that God foresees their sins means that he should not punish sinners, then he should also not reward those who act rightly, for he also foresees their righteous actions. Let us rather confess that nothing in the future is hidden from God's foreknowledge, and that no sin is left unpunished by his justice, for sin is committed by the will, not coerced by God's foreknowledge. So what's the second part of his strategy here? What St. Augustine wants to do in the second part of his strategy is consider a question, or to pose a question. Well, does knowing that someone is going to do something, does it force that person to do it? What he wants to say is not obviously. And he introduces this example involving memory to try to illustrate how knowing that someone is going to do something doesn't necessarily make it unfree in the sense that it is forced. Before I get to his memory example, though, I want to introduce my own. Once again, this is not St. Augustine's example, but this is my own to try to illustrate that, I don't know, maybe St. Augustine's read about this. Maybe knowing that someone will do something doesn't actually force them to do it. So here's the case. Think of your best friend, or the person you know better than anyone else. Now, imagine that you go to a party with this friend, and you're standing next to your friend when someone else at the party comes up to your friend and says something really nasty to your friend. You've seen people, I don't know, say nasty things like this to your friend before. You've been around your friend long enough, right, that you know how your friend reacts in certain situations. And so when that person says that nasty thing to your friend, you cringe. You sort of prepare yourself for what's about to come. You sort of know, maybe in some sense, what your friend is going to do. Based on your experience with this person, you might say that, oh boy, I know what's happening next. I know what's coming. And so that's why you cringe, is because you know what's going to happen. Your friend is going to sock that other guy right in the nose. Now, when you're reflecting on, right, your state that you're in, when you're anticipating, you might even say that you know what your friend is going to do. If I were to approach you at precisely that point and say, okay, you know what your friend is going to do, so what you mean is they're not going to act freely. I think your reply would be, no, that's not what I mean at all. In fact, that's what I'm worried about. That's what I'm anticipating, is just how they're going to act freely. What I'm cringing about is, right, I know what they're going to do freely. And so maybe God's foreknowledge is something like that. He knows us so intimately in the way that you know your best friend, even better than you know your best friend, such that he knows, right, what you're going to do, but only in the way in which you know what your friend is going to do at the party. It doesn't force that person to do it. They're still going to freely do it, but the person knows you so well that they might even say that they know what you're going to do, even though their knowledge doesn't force it. Okay. That's one example. That's my example. It's not exactly St. Augustine's example, but I think it explores this question that he's interested in. The example that he does give, though, is a memory example. So he says, just because I know what I did yesterday this does not mean that I was forced to do what I did yesterday. I might have been forced, but it would not be my knowing it that made it forced. So what's St. Augustine saying here? Think of something like this. Think of all the actions that you performed yesterday. You got them? Now, get out two mental boxes. And in one of the mental boxes, put all of the actions that you, performed yesterday, all of the things that you did yesterday. Put in one box, put all of those things that you did on purpose. And then in the other box, put all the things that you did on accident. And so in other words, what you're doing in the purpose box, right, are those things that you consciously, voluntarily, freely did. And the other things are the ones that I did that by accident. I didn't intend to do that. I don't think I freely did that, right? Maybe someone pushed me, right? Maybe you bumped into someone else in the hallway, but you didn't consciously do it. Someone else bumped you into the other person. Okay, we'll put that in the box of things you did on accident. Now notice what you just did. Do you have something, at least one thing in each box? I think probably you have several things in each box. Now, what does this show us? Well, think about this. So all of these things that you remember yourself doing yesterday, they can't be otherwise than as you remember, if your memory is reliable. Let's say your memory is reliable. If you accurately remember these events, then they're locked in a way, right? They can't be otherwise than how you know them. And yet, even within that category of things that are locked in, those things that you know, right, have occurred, you still put some of them under the category of things you did freely or voluntarily, and other things under the category of things that you did on accident. And maybe what that shows, St. Augustine is arguing, is that just because you know whether something is going to happen or has happened, does not by that very fact mean that all the things have to go in the things you did on accident or things you were forced to do box. It seems like even though they're locked in a way by your knowledge isn't what's forcing them to be unfree. It's compatible with you knowing what they are or what they will be, that they're also freely done. Doesn't mean that everything you did yesterday was freely done, but it is compatible with you doing several different things freely that you know precisely what you did. And so I think those two together are St. Augustine's attempt at a solution to the problem of freedom and foreknowledge. In the first part, he preserved our freedom by packing our freedom into what God knows we will do. He not only knows what we will do, he knows what we'll freely do. And in the second part, he challenges the implicit assumption that just because you know that something's going to happen, that your knowledge forces it to happen. He introduces the memory example to try to challenge this. I introduced the best friend example. I think maybe those two together maybe do give us some reasons to doubt that knowledge is the same thing as forcing something to do it. And so maybe when God knows what you're going to do, just like in other cases, when we know that something has happened or will happen, doesn't force that thing to happen, maybe in the same sense in which God foreknows the future, it doesn't force it either. It's still compatible with it being done freely. So that's what I think what St. Augustine's solution is to the problem of freedom and foreknowledge. But of course, as I said, the problem of freedom and foreknowledge is a valid philosophical argument. You can only get around the argument if you can find some premise that is false. Now, St. Augustine isn't laying out the premises exactly the way in which I did it. But the only way to get around the conclusion is to find something wrong with one of those premises. So you can go on and on about other things, but at the end of the day, right, what I want to say is which premise is false. If you haven't explained to me why one of the premises is false, then you haven't gotten around the problem. Whatever you said is irrelevant. So given what we've heard from St. Augustine's two-part strategy then, what premise is he denying? I think that maybe what he's denying is somewhere around premise 4 or 5. Maybe it depends on what we mean in saying that your actions are necessary. If they're necessary only in the sense that they can't be otherwise, maybe premise 4 goes through. But just because they can't be otherwise, right, doesn't mean necessarily that they're not free, as St. Augustine has been trying to illustrate. So maybe what he's really denying is premise 5. Or if by necessary we mean forced, then I think he'd want to deny premise 4. Even if I cannot do anything other than what God knows I'll do, it doesn't mean my actions are forced by that knowledge. And so maybe it comes down to how we understand the notion of necessity in premises 4 and 5. That will help us to determine which premise St. Augustine is denying, but I think it's somewhere around there. It's either premise 4 or premise 5. Either through his first part of his solution or the second part, it seems to line up somewhere around 4 or 5, depending on what we mean by necessary. So does that solution work? Is that the right way of understanding which premise he's denying? I'm interested in your thoughts. Next time, what I want to look at is how Boethius is going to offer a very different solution to this sort of puzzle. One that's very different from the way in which St. Augustine is going to do it. And Boethius thinks the key to actually solving this problem is to bring in a little bit of the philosophy of time. So we'll do a little bit of philosophy of time from Boethius and see how he's going to use this to try to get around the problem next time.